again to present oh, and build on the concepts that were discussed in our May 2025 webinar. If you're interested in seeing that webinar or going back to review, that is available on the Office of Privacy and Data Protection's website, as well as the slide deck. And as Rhonda mentioned, this recording and slide deck will also be made available. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt and Cheney to get started into more of the great content on navigating AI risks.
Great. Thanks, Katie, and good morning, everybody. For anybody that I don't know, my name is Matt King. I am a Privacy and Data Protection Manager in the State Office of Privacy and Data Protection, and I'll be presenting this morning along with Cheney, who I will let introduce herself a little bit later on. So we're going to do just a quick recap of what we talked about in part one to set the stage. Then we'll talk about some AI risk level determination, so some actual examples of what those may look like to help ground folks. Cheney is then going to go through a really cool new use case scoring tool that she has been developing, and then we'll do a brief introduction to AI impact assessments and how we can use those in practice. So just real quick to get us all on the same page. Last time we were together, we talked about the various ways that AI can show up in our lives, including different uses like Gen AI and computer vision. We also talked about the way that artificial intelligence shows up in different ways, and we experience it in different ways. Sometimes it's very purposefully the thing that we are seeking out and trying to implement. Sometimes it just happens to us. It gets added to software that we're already using, for example. And then the third way is third-party AI use, where we are maybe not using it directly, but we're working with vendors or other third parties who are using it. And so those two things, the different types of AI and then the different ways we experience it, definitely add to some of the complexity of how we navigate it. There are also some other common challenges, including content accuracy, staff adoption, customer adoption, and then data maturity, certainly data readiness and the ability to use high quality data in these systems is a limiting factor in how effective the tools can be. To help navigate these risks, Washington implemented these responsible AI principles, which help guide our work, including the impact assessment that we'll talk about later. And then I think most relevant to at least the first part of our conversation today is that we have implemented a risk level determination process, which is part of the security design review process. So when a new system or project goes through the security design review, agencies are asked to assign a AI risk level to that solution, indicating that it is either low, moderate, or high. So that brings us up to one of the first focuses of today, which is just a little bit more guidance on what a low-risk solution may look like or a high-risk solution may look like. So to remind folks, we do have a definition of high-risk AI system, which comes to us from Executive Order 2401, which is basically just an AI system that creates a high risk to natural person's health, safety, or fundamental rights. So we're really talking about things that impact actual human beings rather than just things that may impact business processes, for example. But when we are thinking about what may be a high risk, we want to make sure that we are considering both direct impacts, which are often more obvious, such as when an AI system is used to determine eligibility for benefits, but also indirect impacts. So something that maybe is a process that's more on the back end that's used to allocate resources in the way that impacts people in a particular community. So we want to be thinking about what could be high risk in a broad sense. And when we're making that risk determination, we want to think about both the magnitude of what that negative impact could be, as well as the likelihood of that impact occurring. So, a pretty common risk framework. We've also published guidance around how to make those determinations. And one of the tricky things around measuring AI risks is that, like privacy risks, it's very, very context specific. There are very few situations where like an AI system itself would be considered high risk. It's not necessarily the system, it's the combination of factors around how it's used, what quality of data it's trained with, what quality of data is used during implementation. And so you really have to take that contextual look and think about risks on a use case by use case basis. And in that way, it means that you have kind of a continual review, and you have to review systems based, again, not just on the technology, but also on what that intended use is and what the other guardrails and controls are that are wrapped around it. So we want to think about the intended use and operating context. So who's going to benefit, who might be negatively impacted, what role do humans have in it? So how autonomous is the solution? Are humans reviewing all the outputs, or just some of them, or maybe none of them? Who are the users? Do members of the public interact with it directly, for example, or is it just state employees who use it? We want to think about data characteristics, including that whole AI lifecycle. So the data that a system is trained on is important, especially in determining whether there may have been bias introduced to it. But we also want to think about what data goes into it from our own inputs during operation. What is the quality of data that we have? Do we have the right types of data to make this thing work appropriately, or is there a mismatch between our data and the data the system's intended to operate? And then we do want to look at some system characteristics. So like, how much filtering is there, for example, to detect harmful outputs? Do we understand how the system works? Does it provide resources that explain why it came to a specific decision? So those are all the types of things that we want to think about. So shifting to high risk uses, and I'm going to couch this all in potential high risk uses and potential low risk uses, because, as I said, it really is very context specific. But this is just intended to give you an idea of where you may be dealing or operating in a high risk area. So the first category is around biometrics, and there are quite a few different ways that this could come up negatively. Like, there are some pretty low risk uses, like when we use our face to log into our iPhone, right? It's stored locally. It doesn't go anywhere else. It's not used for anything else. It's really just a security and convenience feature. But there are lots of other ways where it could be used, where biometrics could be used in a much riskier way. So these are just a few examples. One would be categorizing people based on biometrics. So if you are grouping people by ethnicity, for example, or age, or gender, those are all types of things that could be higher risk with more implications. The second one here is really about how the database, or how your biometrics database is created in the first place. If you are creating that based on scraping publicly available resources, then you have a lot of risks around how consistent that tool is with why that data exists in the first place. You start getting into surveillance issues, which again is which is very related to the third bullet on here, which is using real-time remote biometric identification, which really gets to the idea that, like, even though in some sense we don't have a right to privacy when we're out in a public space, we do have a reasonable expectation that we're not being continually tracked and identified, and biometrics have the potential to be used in a way that is inconsistent with that expectation. So these are all types of potential uses that impact fundamental rights. Law enforcement is another example where there's all kinds of high risk uses that could come up in the law enforcement context. So, the first one here is predictive profiling, which would be the idea of trying to predict whether a specific person is likely to commit a crime. So, a really easy example of this would be monitoring a person in a public space, like in a store, and trying to predict the likelihood that that person may end up shoplifting. Crime prediction is a similar concept, but rather than being tied to a specific person, it's more tied to like an event or a community. So if you think about gathering information and using that for predictive policing and figuring out where to allocate resources, that can be done in ways that have really negative impacts on communities or individuals. Forensic analysis is another one. So again, just the way that it is used in to analyze potential crimes, to find leads, those types of things. And so again, this is a high risk use. Obviously, there could be tremendous benefits there, and this isn't to say that that would be a prohibited practice, but just that it does have much more significant implications. So there need to be much stronger protections to make sure you're getting accurate results, and there are appropriate checks like human review and confirmation. And then the last context, or the last example here, is around immigration or border control. So the way you're allocating resources, if you're in a position to be processing applications, and those types of activities. So these are all things that could impact both public safety and fundamental rights. Critical infrastructure is another example, especially in the public sector. So any use that gets to the management and operation of critical infrastructure could be a high risk use. So the way that we manage our digital infrastructure and the way that people get access to digital goods. Some traffic and transportation uses could also fall under here. So, for example, autonomous vehicles could certainly have or be higher risk, but also things like predictive maintenance for public roadways or analyzing the behavior of actual humans who are in charge of safety. So those are a couple traffic and transportation uses, and then also other utilities. So anything around how utilities like water, gas, and electricity are actually supplied and managed could be higher risk. So these are all things that once something goes wrong could have really significant negative impacts on people's health and safety. Employment is another one. So using artificial intelligence in the context of our employment relationship with employees can have some high risk use cases with big negative impacts that impact fundamental rights. So examples would be hiring using artificial intelligence to screen or assess employees. Once you have an employee in place, using artificial intelligence to monitor their performance or write their performance reviews or just in general evaluate their performance can definitely be a high risk use. And then emotion detection is another one. This is one where we do see some uses around like sentiment analysis of customers in particular. Like in call centers, for example. But that same type of technology is definitely riskier with bigger implications when used in the workplace. The next category is around administration of justice. So we're really mostly talking here about the relationship that we have with the courts. And so when courts use AI, even AI that may be totally innocuous in other contexts, when they use that to research and interpret the law and actually make decisions that have very, very real impacts on people, those can be high risks that impact both public safety and fundamental rights. And then the last one here is around access to public services, which I think for a lot of the people on the call today is likely going to be the most likely place where this comes up. So we're really talking about anything in the workstream that affects how people get access to public benefits and services. So that could be identity verification to apply in the first place. It could be automated evaluation of applications or figuring out how to, or in managing how those benefits are actually accessed and distributed. And depending on the service, those are all things that could have health, safety, and fundamental rights implications. Coming up with low risk examples was actually a little bit harder, and there's not that much out there because of the fact that even really, again, innocuous systems can be used in negative ways if used incorrectly. But a few examples that are almost always going to be low risk would include autocorrect and text prediction. So we've had those types of tools built into all kinds of applications for a long time, and they're unlikely to lead to negative impacts. Document summarization would be another example. You certainly want to make sure that you're reviewing those summaries and using them appropriately, but most likely going to be low risk. There are some environmental monitoring examples that I'd consider low risk. So one that I think a lot of people have heard about is eelgrass monitoring or smoke detection for detecting wildfires. So those would be things that have big benefits and are unlikely to lead to negative impacts. And then recommender systems. So recommender system may be like in Netflix, what it recommends the next show to watch, or a product that you may want to purchase from Amazon. So in the public sector, we may have things more like news recommendations, or there's even an example of like recommending the font to use in a particular document. So those types of things tend to be low risk. And then just about everything else is going to fall in this middle ground, where you really have to consider all the factors and how it's going to be used and what types of controls you have in place. So with chatbots, there are certainly some kind of internal uses that may not have big implications, but if there is an external facing chatbot and people rely on it to make decisions in ways that could impact their health or safety, then obviously the implications are going to be much greater around how accurate it is. Language translation is another one where we see huge potential for this. But it really depends on the context. I was traveling in Mexico City recently, and I was able to, when I was in a museum, I could like use my phone and just hover it over all the signs that were in Spanish, and just like read them perfectly on my phone. The museum didn't have to translate anything to English. I didn't really care if a word or two was wrong. It worked perfectly. But if you are using that same solution, for access to public benefits, it could have really negative implications. And you also need to be really careful around sort of like domain specific words, right? So like in the permitting process, you have specific language that may be different than a general purpose, like language translation service comprehends. Same with the medical context. Transcripts and dictation are similar. I think we all probably use that at least occasionally uh, in our work meetings. Generally pretty low risk. But there are other situations where it could have much bigger implications. So, for example, it's pretty common to see tools now in the medical context where the AI solution may be listening to doctor-patient conversation and then actually creates the notes from that. And obviously the implications, if that goes wrong, are much, much higher, and you need to be more careful about that use. There are other, I gave a couple of examples of environmental monitoring activities that could be low risk, but you could also have much higher risk things, like if you're actually forecasting negative environmental conditions that are going to happen in ways that impact people and influence their behavior, or if you're allocating resources based on those forecasts, again, that's going to be much riskier. And then the last one I put on here is general purpose models. So like the ChatGPT that we are all familiar with, that these tend to be low risk, but you can use them in really negative ways if you don't have appropriate training and people don't understand um, their responsibilities and limitations of the tools. So they're unlikely that these tens of tools would ever get to the high risk category, but they do have their own unique considerations, and you don't just want to assume that they're low risk. Um, so with that background, I will turn it over to Cheney to talk about a use case scoring tool and how you, at least partially, how you consider some of these are risks and avoid them and focus on high impact solutions.
Thank you. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Cheney Curry. I'm our Enterprise AI Business Architect here at WaTech. And what I wanted to introduce today was a method you could use within your own agency to actually take all of the potential AI use cases you've scoured for and prioritize them in a way where you're really focusing on those high value use cases first and not really worrying about the lower value ones. Because as somebody working in this space, there is a lot of potential use cases you could consider. So next slide, please. So the first thing I wanted to do was ground us in an understanding of what a use case actually is, because over the years, the term use case has really taken on a more holistic definition than what it originally was within the IT context. So the definition I created, you could probably tell is actually was developed with the assistance from ChatGPT because it's a little academic and a little wordy. So the definition is a use case is a contextual narrative that describes how a user achieves a goal within a broader system, shaped by business objectives, environmental conditions, and technological interactions. In a less wordy definition, it's really a use case is how someone uses something to achieve a goal, and that something typically is technology. Similar actually to the way that you would look at risk, there are certain characteristics that are prevalent throughout almost all use cases, or they should be. The first one is really describing that problem that you want to solve with the use case. So if you're familiar with something like a problem statement or a rough statement, bottom line up front, this is really defining what is the problem that the use case is addressing, who's impacted by it and how. And if you wanted to dig even deeper, you could think about the user personas themselves. What are the needs, goals, and motivations of the users that are impacted by the problem? Similarly to assessing risk, you also want to look at the business and strategic context. So why is this use case important? What value does it generate? How does it relate to your strategic goals? And then what change management and readiness needs from a business context need to be considered? So do you need to change your operating model? Do you need to train up your staff? There's things you want to think about when you're looking at use cases around what it means to the business. And then the last common characteristic around a use case is the operating context. So these are really the mechanics behind what makes that use case work. So when and where is this happening? Is it over the phone? Is it on a website? Is it through email? What other technology or laws, regulations, services, other users might shape the experience within that use case? What are the internal and external constraints and requirements you need to consider? And where does it interface with other technology or humans? So you can see there's actually like a lot of information you could collect around a use case. And when you have many use cases, that's a lot of information to try to harness. So next slide. What I wanted to do was start us off with how to just start to create an inventory of use cases. So I'm going to, after I present, share a spreadsheet that has several tabs of templates that you can use to help start to put this work together. But the first one is a very high level use case inventory. And it is really only 5 columns, and it's intended to be kind of a staging area for those unprioritized use cases. So you have a place to document them, but you're really just documenting them at a high level. You're not digging into the details yet. So within this inventory, you have your the name. I do recommend some sort of numbering convention so it's easy to trace across different documents, and then a description, the problem it's trying to solve, and its value proposition. So for this particular example that we're going to use throughout this presentation, I'm going to take that top one, which is public-facing document translation, and we're going to break that down over the course of the next few slides. But in the inventory, this is really described as translation of Category 1 written documentation. The idea here would be translation of PDFs or forms on a website or just the public facing information on a website. So it's truly just that Category 1 stuff that you can find on a website. The problem that it's trying to solve is that we have over 500,000 people within our state who speak a primary language other than English, and they need to access the same government services that the rest of us do. Not having public data easily translated into their chosen language can result in a delay of services, non-compliance, or even potentially a loss of rights. So there's a pretty significant problem that we want to make sure we're solving. And the value here is that all people who interact with us, regardless of their language preference, are able to get the information they need without needing to acquire a translator or find somebody to help them. They can do this with no intervention. So it's a pretty big value if they can go to our website, get what they need without having to do anything else. How I got this was to actually conduct a discovery workshop with a group of folks who worked within language services. And we brainstormed all the different kinds of ways we thought AI could be used in the space. And even just within that language services category, we had over 30 use cases that we described. So as you can imagine, these inventories can get really large, and that's why having an inventory and a scoring mechanism is going to become really important. So I will go into what that looks like. Next slide. So I wanted to start with the end in mind. This is the end result, a template of the end result that you could use to help visualize what has been prioritized as those use cases that we want to further develop. On the left, you'll see that there is criteria around value, and that is your up and down axis. And then on the left to right axis, we have criteria around feasibility. And the idea here is that any use cases that land in that green space are ones that are determined to be high value and easy to implement, so highly feasible. What I would use this as is in conversations with leadership when you're trying to make decisions on what use case to tackle first, you really only focus on the ones that land in that green space. The other parts of those grids, like especially in the red space, you just don't worry about at the moment. You focus on the green. And I will show you at the end of this an example of one that's been filled out. Next slide. So this is another template, and this and the matrix prior will also be available in the spreadsheet I'll share. But this is just a way to visualize all the use cases and their scores in a different kind of sheet. If you wanted, you could condense this with an inventory, but this is really just a list of use cases. You would plug their scores in here, and then you could start to see which ones are rising to the top. You could use this solo, or you can use this in conjunction with that matrix to tell that visual story. Next slide. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually dig into what these criteria are, and I'm going to use that public-facing document translation use case as an example moving through this. Full disclosure, I made up a lot of the information here, so it's possible it's not fully aligned, but that's okay. It's just an example. And so, this is fairly dense. So if you do have any questions after the training or you'd like more help with this, getting this launched in your own agency, please feel free to let us know. So that being said, the first criteria within the value section, so that up and down part of the matrix, is strategic alignment. So the question you want to answer here is, how well does this use case align to agency or state strategic goals and initiatives? In my example of public-facing document translation, We know that that is directly aligned to a statewide strategic goal of leave no community behind. But there was only moderate alignment to our personal operational goals, and we had leadership that supports the effort, but no real champions. So that landed that score as a 3 out of 5. In the next set criteria, that's impact and business value. So the question you want to answer here is how significant is a potential measurable benefit to the agency or state? So this is really those hard numbers. Like, can you actually cattle or quantify the benefit and show that you've made an improvement? In our use case example, I scored this a 4 because we know that this is going to increase our LEP customer, which stands for language, oh God, limited English proficiency. So our LEP customers' ability to access information will definitely be increased, and their access to services, and it'll comply with regulations. And I said that it improved XX KPI. So I'm making up that we had a KPI that it could actually directly improve, and that bumps that score up a bit. So we scored it a 4. And then the final criteria within value is a time to value. So this is really how long will it take for that use case to deliver those measurable benefits to the agency or state? Because sometimes there is a ramp up there. This one, because in this example, we know that it's public facing category 1 information. We know that there's stuff already in place that will probably address this use case, and that it can be implemented almost immediately. So the second somebody accesses our website, they're going to be able to use this tool. I'm also making an assumption that we have some sort of Google Analytics or web metrics that would be able to identify those results with no need to develop anything new, any kind of new metric tool. So it's pretty easy, and it's going to happen almost immediately. So we scored this a 5. So within the value criteria for this use case, they scored a 12 out of 15, which is pretty good. Next slide. So the next section is going to have 4 criteria, and this is the feasibility. So this is that left to right axis on the matrix. The first one, which we have spent most of this webinar covering, is that risk level. And it's that answering that question of how risky is this use case? It feels weird to say, but the higher number, the lower risk. So in this case, because we know that this use case is limited to category 1 information that's available on a website, it's not a generative AI tool, so it's not intended to generate anything new. And because of those factors, we said it's a pretty low risk, so we scored it a 5, so the top score you can make there. The next criteria is around interested party support. So this is how committed is the agency or the state to implement this use case. So this is really not just your leadership, like how much they're championing this work, but how committed are the people who are actually going to implement the tool, the people impacted by it, the people who support it. We want to make sure that everybody is on board, because if they're not, that can be a really big factor in being able to be successful. In this case, because of the work we've been doing in statewide discovery workshops, we know that there are many agencies that are actively involved in and championing this use case. Like, this is something almost everybody wants. And it's because it's easy to do, it's got a lot of support. So we scored the top again as a 5. And then in the last section we have, on this slide, we have implementation feasibility. And this is answering how prepared is the agency or the state to implement this use case. And this is a big bucket. So this is the estimated level of effort to implement the use case. And this can include data readiness. So is your data ready to do this work? Required skill sets. So how, like, the people who are going to do this work, do they know how to do it? How is this stacking up with your existing technology? And what other kind of change management considerations might you need to make? So there's like a lot of questions to answer in here. And with this case, we said, well, we're assuming that existing tool sets are already available to do this work. We know it's already happening, so there's very low development needs. We know the data types and formats and classifications already. They're already set up. It's on a website. So really, there's not a ton of work to do here. So it seems fairly feasible. So we scored this one a 4. Next slide. So the last two sections within feasibility, we have costs. As we know in this climate currently, this is probably a really important factor. And this is really thinking about the total cost of implementation and ongoing support, because that is a big thing in AI. It can be cheap to implement, but you need to consider what it means to monitor and quality control that AI tool. So those are things to consider within cost. And does the agency have capacity to pay for it is another really important question. With this use case, we know that we have existing tools already, and additional tools are fairly cheap, so they can be acquired easily using direct buy. And there's an opportunity here to potentially identify an enterprise solution that we can maybe negotiate a smaller cost on. So we scored this one as a 4. And the last criteria, there's a lot, is scalability and configurability. So this is really how quick can we scale this use case to support additional business areas or agencies, and how easy is it to configure? Because again, in this use case, the solutions are already available and they're specialized to accommodate these needs. We know that it's easy to scale. You don't need to reconfigure every time you do it. So it's actually pretty decent. So we scored it a 4. So the total feasibility score in this particular use case is 22 out of 40. I don't remember, but it's 22, which is pretty decent. So yeah, this is what this looks like in practice. So I put 2 other use cases on here that we have scored, so you can kind of see a comparison, and that the other 2 scored fairly high, but this document translation scored the highest. So that's why we are focusing on it. One thing I do want to mention is that this particular scoring criteria is not weighted, and that is something you might want to consider within your agency if there are certain criteria that mean more than others, like cost might need to be weighted higher. That is something you could do, but this is a straight scoring, and it's just intended to be an easy thing to pick up. Next slide. So I'm not going to dig into this in any kind of detail, but this is available in that spreadsheet I will share as well. And this just breaks down some more guidance on how you could think about those scores. Another thing to think about is that there is a lot of data you could potentially collect just to score, but I would recommend doing this as quickly as possible with the information you already have. And then as you understand your top scored use cases, that's when you actually really dig into the details and spend the time. But if you tried to do that with every use case, that's all you're ever going to do. So this will hopefully help you think about how to quantify some of those scores. And next slide. So this is what it looks like as a final visual. So right now, I mean, you'd probably have a lot more than 3, but I just have 3 on here right now. And as you can see in the visual itself, it shows that if I were to present this to leadership, I would say, we really want to focus on public-facing document translation. And then next, we'll focus on internal-facing chatbots, because these both scored pretty high. But we know that there's a lot of complexity around permit processing agents, which was the 3rd use case. And so we're probably going to focus on that, but it's going to come 3rd. And then you can have a conversation and a negotiation on where you actually want to focus as an agency. So this will hopefully help tell that story to the folks that help you make those decisions. And I think that is my last slide. I'm pretty sure. So this was a lot of content, and we are more than willing to help you with this if it's something you're interested in. I will share the spreadsheet so that you have a place to start. Feel free to use it if you'd like and adjust it to meet your needs. And yeah, thank you so much for your time, and I will return this back to Matt.
Thanks, Cheney. We really appreciate you coming and joining us, and I'm really excited about this resource. I think we sometimes see, we are all public servants that are very interested in improving how we deliver services, right? And so we often see a focus on like these really high impact, high value solutions that are also potentially very risky or that we don't have the data or expertise to actually implement. And we end up kind of in that upper left box, sort of spinning our wheels. And I think that this is a really helpful tool to help avoid that and focus on easy wins and build up that expertise and just frame those conversations when those types of things come up. So really appreciate your development of this tool and coming to share it with us. For the last bit today, we're going to talk a little bit about AI risk assessments or impact assessments. So let's say you did not use Cheney's prioritization tool, and you decided you're going to go forward with a really high risk tool anyways. In that case, you will need to do a full AI risk assessment. And so we'll walk through kind of what the pieces of that are. But even more important, I think this is really helpful just for posing questions that you should be asking about any AI tool. And so I guess maybe I should step back a little bit in terms of talking about the AI risk assessment and how we are thinking about it. It is basically broken up into different sections based on the Washington Responsible AI Principles. And so through that lens, it includes a series of questions that help you evaluate whether a particular tool aligns with those responsible AI principles. So it may be more important in a high-risk solution, but they're good questions to ask about any AI solution. And so that's really the context in which I wanted to go over this a little bit this morning. So we don't have a finalized tool that we'll be sharing out today, but we do have a template that has been piloted with groups and is under continual refinement. So the content in this deck is an approximate representation of what's in there, maybe not the exact words, but definitely includes the concepts that we're trying to capture in that assessment tool. The first thing that you want to gather, this is pretty obvious and straightforward, I think, is just the operating context. So figuring out some of that like baseline context, what laws apply, what is the purpose of this thing, what is the solution that you're trying to solve, and why are you choosing AI to do it? And then you just heard Cheney talking about resourcing. So do you have funds not just for the deployment, where you may have a lot of vendor support, but also for ongoing operation or to potentially scale it in the future? And then also, do you have the appropriate expertise to implement it effectively? The next section, we really start getting more into the principles themselves. The first one here is around public purpose and social benefit, so the concept that AI should be helping us deliver better services. So we want to look at who the system is intended to benefit, and also how we're going to measure and monitor that. So establishing those metrics so we can make sure it's actually doing what we think it is intended to do. We want to look at why this solution, why is AI better than a non-AI solution, and why this type of AI. And then we also want to start thinking about system users. Is it internal users or external users? And is it going to impact individuals or communities who are not system users and may not be aware that the system is being used at all? The next section is around the principle of safe, secure, and resilient, which is the idea that we should be minimizing harm and ensuring systems are reliable and controllable by humans. So to that end, we want to evaluate the role of humans. How much autonomy does the system have? And there can be a huge range here. Some systems have no human review, or only when there are certain flags or triggers for review, whereas others, such as like a ChatGPT type tool, we would expect humans to be looking at all outputs and figuring out whether they're reliable before using them. And we also want to look at what is in place to make sure humans understand the responsibilities. So training, do the people using these systems understand the limitations? We want to look at output filtering and monitoring. So if there are potential harmful outputs that we are aware of, what controls are in place to detect those and prevent them. And then we also want to look at system interdependencies. So one potential risk with these AI systems is as they build on each other, it's hard to isolate incidents and figure out where an error is occurring. So we want to make sure how the whole ecosystem of connected systems works. Next section is about valid and reliable, which is the idea that we want systems that produce accurate and valid outputs. So again, we want to think about those metrics, and we want to think about them not just at the beginning. We don't just want to look at like what testing has a vendor done, but also how do we continue to measure that on an ongoing basis. And then we also want to think about what does our incident assessment and response process look like. And when I say incident, I don't mean in the security incident sense where we often hear that term, although that could be part of it. But we're really thinking about any incident that affects system performance that starts coming up if the system starts having unexpected or inappropriate outcomes. How do we identify those types of incidents, remediate them, and respond to recover from that? The next section is about fairness, inclusion, and non-discrimination. So, and this is the idea that we want to support communities and use these tools fairly in ways that reduce harmful bias and discrimination. So first thing we need to do is we already looked at who the system is going to benefit. Now we want to look at who could potentially be adversely impacted. We want to think about bias. So does the data that's used in the system, both when it's trained and then when it's actually operated, accurately represent impacted communities? And how do we measure that bias? What happens if it falls below a certain threshold? And we also want to think about what controls are in place to avoid introducing bias. So even if you measure bias at implementation, it's possible that in some types of systems, users can actually introduce bias. So, for example, if there are feedback loops built in where the system is refined based on the prompts that users are giving it, then you can actually end up introducing those users' biases into the system, and you get sort of a downward spiral of negative outcomes. And then the last thing here is about community engagement, especially for systems that are likely to impact vulnerable populations. We want to think about how have we engaged those communities in system design, and what mechanisms do we have in place to incorporate feedback. The next section is around privacy and data protection. So we want to identify the specific types of information that are involved. If we're in a high-risk situation in particular, and it does involve personal information, then that is a system that should have a privacy impact assessment. So you want to verify that. And then you want to look at transparency and opt-out. So here we're thinking specifically about where there are systems that a person is not directly interacting with that are used on the back end. Then you want to think about how individuals are notified that their information is being used and processed by the AI system, and whether there are mechanisms to opt out of that processing. Section 8 is about accountability and responsibility. So again, feedback mechanisms. How is feedback gathered and acted on? Is there a process or continuous process for that? What kind of due diligence have we done? So we want to make sure we have contractual assurances in place. One obvious example is if we're using category 3 or 4 information, then we need appropriate data sharing agreements in place. We want to think about whether it is appropriate for whoever the vendor is that's supporting the system to be using state data to train and refine the model. We want to, especially in high-risk solutions, we want to verify that the vendors have certified that they have an AI governance program consistent with the NIST Artificial Intelligence Risk Management Framework, which is a requirement under Executive Order 2401. And then we want to look at impacts to the natural environment. So to the extent that we can, I know there's ongoing work around this to develop models for this, but we want to think about things such as increased water use, carbon emissions, or high-tech waste, especially trying to compare the use of the AI system versus what the impact would be using other traditional methods. uh, transparency and auditability. So here we're talking about creating kind of a record of processes and trying to foster trust through having accountability. So user notification. So this is sort of a different angle on transparency. Before I mentioned transparency around systems that are on the back end. This is more about when a user that's maybe out in the public is directly interacting with a human. Do they know that? Is that clearly displayed to them? Do they understand the limitations of the system that they're interacting with and how they're supposed to use it? We want to think about whether they have the ability to opt out. And if they do, how clear is that to them? Is it explained? Does the alternative process create additional burdens for them? And then we also want to think about logging. So in particular, are we logging inputs and outputs? And this is an area where there can be a little bit of a tension with privacy considerations, where we may not necessarily want to track every interaction that a user is having with one of these systems. On the other hand, if members of the public are interacting directly with a chatbot, as an example, and they claim that they were given a harmful or malicious output, it would be very good for us to have a mechanism to verify whether that incident actually occurred or not. So there's definitely a balancing act that needs to be navigated there. And then the last section is around whether the system is explainable and interpretable. So with explainability, we're thinking about to what extent do we understand the actual way that the system functions and just kind of like the general processes of how the system comes to an outcome. So a resource for this would be model cards, which are resources published by AI vendors that are intended to promote transparency, and they include things like what the intended purpose is, what the limitations are, and what the known risks are associated with that system. So those can be a very helpful resource. And then we also want to think about output justification. So for not looking at the system in general, but actually at the more granular level of specific outputs. Is the system like backing it up? Are they providing citation or other resources that allow humans to have the right level of review and to confirm the information that they're receiving? And so all of those things, I think together, you're unlikely to go through all of those questions for every particular system, but the more you're familiar with these concepts, I think the more you'll be able to effectively evaluate new AI uses and again, have that framework to ask the right questions. So in general, today, we talked about how the level of risk is going to depend on the intended use in the operating context, the data characteristics and system characteristics and safeguards. And unfortunately, because of that context-specific need, there are some use cases that are almost always at high risk, and some that'll be almost always low risk, but most of them are going to require some type of individual review considering all of those factors together. But we have tools like the use case scoring tool that Cheney presented on and shared that can help agencies identify high value, highly feasible uses while avoiding low impact and high risk uses. And then if you do end up in a situation where you're implementing a high-risk system, you should do an AI risk assessment, but the concepts from those assessments are widely applicable to other uses and are a helpful way to make sure you're acting consistently with the state's responsible AI principles. And so that brings us to the end this morning. Thank you so much for your continued engagement. If you have any questions, you can send them to privacy@watech.wa.gov, and we'll get back to you or get them to the appropriate person if it's not us. Thank you.